The fluorescent light above Hank Mercer's workbench had been flickering for 3 weeks. He kept meaning to replace the bulb. He never did. By the time October settled over Knoxville like a damp wool blanket, the flicker had become part of the rhythm of the garage. 2 short pulses, then a long, steady hum, then 2 short pulses again. A metronome for a man who had learned to measure his life in small, predictable cycles. It was 14 minutes past 3 in the morning when Hank set down his torque wrench and reached for the rag hanging off the side of the engine block. The 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail had been in various states of disassembly for 6 weeks, not because it was beyond repair, but because Hank worked at the pace of a man with nowhere to be and no one waiting. He wiped his hands slowly, finger by finger, the way his father had taught him, the way you treat tools that have served you well. At 45, Hank Mercer's hands told the whole story. Thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the creases with grease that soap could no longer reach. Scarred across the right palm from a chain slip in 1999 that had required 11 stitches and a ride to UT Medical Center in the back of someone else's pickup. The tattoos on his forearms, a compass rose on the left, a pocket watch stopped at 6:47 on the right, other images layered around them like pages in a book no one had ever asked to read, disappeared under the rolled sleeves of his flannel shirt when he was working. He rolled them down now against the October cold that seeped through the garage walls without apology. The garage sat at the back of the lot on Cedar Lane, connected to the house by a gravel path that Hank had edged with railroad ties sometime around 2019 and never bothered to plant anything along. The house itself was a 3-bedroom ranch he'd gotten in the divorce settlement 7 years ago, mostly because his ex-wife Paula had looked at it the way people look at things they never wanted in the first place. She'd taken the furniture, the good dishes, and the dog. Hank had kept the garage, the Softail, and the coffee maker, which was all he'd needed to confirm the divorce was fair. Cedar Lane was a quiet street on the eastern edge of Knoxville, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class 40 years ago and had since drifted into a comfortable, unremarkable respectability. Porch lights on timers, minivans in driveways, a neighborhood watch sign at the corner that someone had zip-tied to the stop sign post so long ago that the plastic had yellowed and cracked at the edges. Hank had never attended a neighborhood watch meeting. He was fairly certain the neighborhood watched him instead. He poured the last of the coffee from the carafe he kept on the shelf above the mini-fridge. It had been sitting since 7 in the evening and tasted like something between motor oil and regret, but Hank drank it without expression and set the mug back on the shelf. He had a high threshold for things that weren't pleasant. Life had built that threshold carefully, one disappointment at a time, and he had come to regard it not as damage, but as infrastructure. The radio on the workbench was tuned to a station out of Nashville that played classic country after midnight, the kind of music that assumed everyone listening had lost something and was simply deciding how to carry it. Hank kept the volume low. Merle Haggard at 2/3 volume was company. At full volume it was commentary, and he wasn't in the mood for commentary tonight. He was reaching for the torque wrench again when he heard it. He stopped. It was quiet enough that most people would have missed it, written it off as a settling board or a night animal moving along the base of the fence. But Hank had spent enough years in garages, in silence, listening to machines tell him what was wrong with them through sound alone, that his ears had developed the particular sensitivity of someone who had learned that small noises were usually the important ones. A scratching against the metal base of the garage door, then nothing. Then a sound so faint it barely qualified as a sound at all, a soft, compressed exhale, the kind of breath a person makes when they are trying very hard not to make any sound at all, and their body has stopped cooperating. Hank set the wrench down without thinking about it. He crossed the garage floor in 6 steps and opened the side door, the one that led onto the gravel driveway. The October air hit him immediately, cold and damp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. He looked left toward the street. Empty. He looked right toward the gate that separated the driveway from the backyard. Then he looked down. She was pressed against the base of the garage door on the outside, her small body folded into the tightest possible configuration, knees pulled against her chest, arms wrapped around her knees, chin down. She was wearing a cotton nightgown, pink with small yellow flowers printed on it, and nothing else. No shoes, no jacket, no socks. Her feet, small and pale, rested against the cold concrete of the driveway apron, and the soles were dark with the kind of dirt that accumulates over distance, over pavement and gravel and wet grass. She had been walking for a while. Her hair was blonde, the color of old honey, and it had fallen over her face in tangled curtains. She was shaking, not the exaggerated trembling of someone performing distress, but the deep, involuntary shaking of a body that has used up everything it had and is now operating on something beyond reserve. Hank stood in the doorway for a long moment. He was a man who had worked through situations requiring calm and precision for his entire adult life. An engine that won't turn over at midnight. A customer's bike that seizes on the highway and gets trailered in at 2 in the morning. Moments when panic would be catastrophic and stillness was the only useful tool. He reached for that stillness now. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough from hours of silence, rougher than he intended. He softened it as much as his voice was capable of being softened, which wasn't much, but he tried. "Hey, you okay?" The girl didn't look up. She pressed herself tighter against the garage door, her thin shoulders rising toward her ears as if she were trying to make herself smaller than she already was. Hank crouched down. His knees cracked loud enough to echo off the driveway concrete, and some distant part of him registered the absurdity. A tattooed 45-year-old mechanic crouching in his driveway at 3 in the morning, trying not to frighten a child the size of a minute. He kept his hands visible, resting on his knees, open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Are you lost?" No answer, just the shaking. He looked past her to Cedar Lane. The street was dark. Every house on both sides sealed up, porch lights burning on their timers, curtains drawn. No one was outside calling a name into the night. No car moving slowly down the street with its window down. No flashlight sweeping across front yards. Wherever this child had come from, no one on Cedar Lane was out looking for her. Hank exhaled slowly through his nose. He stood up, went back into the garage, and lifted the old flannel jacket off the hook near the door. The heavy one, dark green, lined with wool. The one he wore when he rode in November, and the cold had teeth. It smelled like engine grease and old coffee, and the particular combination of oil and cold air that was, to Hank, simply the smell of work. He brought it back out and crouched again, and this time he laid the jacket gently on the concrete beside the girl. Not on her, beside her. Close enough to reach, far enough that she wouldn't feel crowded. "Here," he said, "put that on. You're going to freeze out here." For a moment, nothing. Then her hand appeared from behind her curtain of hair, small, pale, the nails bitten down to nothing. The hand reached out and pulled the jacket toward her, and she wrapped it around her shoulders in a single motion that was half instinct and half the practiced deficiency of a child who had learned to accept warmth when it was offered because it wasn't always offered twice. The sleeves hung past her hands by the length of a forearm. She looked up. Hank had been prepared for fear. He had been prepared for tears, for screaming, for the panicked flight response of a child confronted with a large, bearded, tattooed stranger in the middle of the night. What he was not prepared for were her eyes. They were blue, a deep, particular blue, not the pale, washed-out blue of faded denim, but something closer to the color of the sky at 5 in the morning, just before the light commits to coming. And they were not afraid. They were tired. Not the tired of a child who needs sleep, but the tired of something that runs much deeper than sleep. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a person when the world has been unkind for longer than they had the vocabulary to explain. She looked at him with those eyes, and she didn't look away. And Hank, who had not been looked at that directly by anyone in longer than he could immediately recall, felt something shift in his chest, like a piece of old machinery finding its alignment. "What's your name, Warschauer?" she asked. She considered him for a long moment, the way a person considers a door before deciding whether to open it. "Daisy," she said. Her voice was barely above the hum of the fluorescent light behind him. One word offered like something fragile. Hank nodded once, slowly, as if this were the most significant piece of information he had received in a long time. "Okay, Daisy, I'm Hank." He kept his voice level. "How about you come inside where it's warm and we figure out where you belong?" She didn't move immediately. She studied him the way she had studied the door. The beard, the lines around his eyes, the hands resting open on his knees. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it, because after a moment she stood up on unsteady legs, the flannel jacket hanging to her knees, and followed him through the door and into the garage. Hank set up the old camping chair near the space heater in the corner, the one he used in winter when the garage dropped below 40 degrees and his hands stopped cooperating with fine mechanical work. He plugged the heater in and adjusted it toward the chair. Daisy climbed up into it without being asked, pulled the jacket tighter around her, and sat with her feet dangling above the concrete floor, watching him. He made hot chocolate from the packets he kept in the cabinet above the coffee maker, a habit left over from the winters when his nephew visited years ago, before the nephew had grown up and moved to Chattanooga, and visits became Christmas cards that arrived in January. He warmed the water in the microwave, stirred the powder in a mug that said Mercer Custom Mechanics on the side, and handed it to her. She took it with both hands and held it against her chest before she drank. She didn't speak, she simply watched him, tracking every movement he made around the garage with those steady blue eyes. Hank sat down on the overturned milk crate he used as a step stool when he needed to reach the upper shelves, and he pulled out his phone. He knew what the right thing was. He had known it from the moment he saw her on the driveway. A child, alone at 3 in the morning in October, in a nightgown and no shoes. There was no version of that situation where you didn't make the call. He dialed the non-emergency line for the Knox County Sheriff's Office and stated the facts as plainly as he knew how to state them. There was a young child in his garage. She appeared to be approximately 6 years old. She was uninjured. She had given her name as Daisy. She had appeared at his door on foot, in inadequate clothing, alone. He gave his name and his address and answered every question the dispatcher asked, and when the dispatcher told him deputies would be there in 20 minutes, he said thank you and hung up. Then he sat back down on the milk crate and waited. He didn't pepper her with questions. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances she hadn't asked for. He just sat, close enough that she wasn't alone, far enough that she had room, and let the space heater do its work. "You want more?" he asked, nodding at the mug when she finished. She shook her head. Then after a pause, "It was good." 2 more words. Hank received them the same way he'd received the first one, without fanfare, without the excessive enthusiasm adults sometimes perform for children, like a kind of currency they expect to be repaid in trust. "Good," he said. The deputies arrived in 18 minutes, 2 of them riding together in a single cruiser, both younger than Hank by at least 15 years. The first one, a deputy named Alderman with a close-cropped beard and a body camera that blinked red on his chest, scanned Hank with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to read people quickly and had filed Hank under a specific category before he'd finished extending his hand for the handshake. Hank shook it anyway. "She's inside," he said. "She's warm. She had some hot chocolate. Her name's Daisy, that's all I know." They went past him into the garage. Hank stayed by the door, arms crossed over his chest, and watched them approach Daisy with the careful, practiced gentleness of training, voices low, postures non-threatening, the second deputy crouching to eye level. Daisy watched them the way she had watched everything since she arrived, with her blue eyes steady and her body very still. She didn't reach for them the way some children will reach for a uniform because a uniform means safety. She sat in the camping chair with the flannel jacket around her shoulders, and she answered their questions in the same quiet voice she'd used with Hank. And when they asked her where she lived, she said nothing at all. The deputies called it in. Hank heard the dispatcher's voice crackling back at them, heard the cross-referencing, the checking of databases, and then the shift in the second deputy's posture that told him they'd found something. They had. Her full name was Elena Grace Crane. She went by Daisy. She was 6 years old. She had been flagged in a missing persons alert filed 2 hours earlier by a family in a town called Maryville, about 16 miles southwest of where they were standing. She was currently in the temporary foster custody of her maternal aunt and her aunt's husband, a couple named Brenda and Terry Crane, under a family court order that had been in place for 4 months. Hank listened to this and said nothing. What he thought, standing in the doorway of his own garage at 3:30 in the morning, while a 6-year-old girl sat in his camping chair in an oversized jacket that belonged to him, was that a child in foster care doesn't walk 16 miles barefoot in October for no reason. What he thought was that the words temporary custody and family court order and missing persons alert added up to a picture he didn't fully know but could read the broad outlines of. What he thought was that Daisy had not ended up on his driveway by accident. He didn't say any of this. Loretta Vance arrived at 6:32 in the morning, just as the first gray light was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. She drove a county vehicle, a white Chevy Equinox with a small dent in the rear bumper and a parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with silver hair cut practically short, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and a canvas tote bag over one shoulder that appeared to contain approximately 30% more paperwork than it was designed to hold. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had been doing a difficult job for a long time and had made peace with the fact that it would never get easier, only more familiar. She surveyed the garage with the expression Hank had come to recognize over the course of the past 3 hours from every official who had walked through his door, a quick, comprehensive assessment that took in the motorcycles in various states of repair, the tool walls, the grease-stained floor, the overturned milk crate, the flannel jacket on the camping chair, and the man standing beside all of it, and arranged these things into a category. Hank was used to being categorized. He had been categorized his whole life. "Mr. Mercer," Loretta said, "I'm Loretta Vance with the Department of Children's Services. I need to ask you a few questions about the circumstances under which you found the child." "She found me," Hank said. "I didn't find her." Loretta looked at him over her glasses. There was something in the look that wasn't hostility, more like recalibration, a small involuntary acknowledgement that the sentence had been more precise than she'd expected. "That's a distinction worth making," she said. "I appreciate it." She interviewed him for 35 minutes, standing with her tote bag and her notepad, asking questions in the flat, unhurried tone of someone who has asked them so many times that the words have worn smooth. His occupation, his marital status, his relationship to the child, whether he had any family nearby, whether he had a criminal record. He answered everything. When she asked about the criminal record, he told her about the DUI from 2003, 22 years ago, the fine, the mandatory program, the expungement that had followed. He told her it was the last time he'd had a drink. She wrote it all down in handwriting too small for him to read from where he stood. When it was time for Loretta to take Daisy, something happened that made every person in the garage go still. Daisy climbed down from the camping chair. She walked across the concrete floor on her bare feet, the soles still dark with the distance she had traveled, and she crossed to where Hank was standing by the workbench. She didn't take his hand. She didn't wrap herself around his leg. She simply stood next to him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against the side of his knee, and she looked up at Loretta Vance with an expression that required no translation. She was not going to pretend this was fine. Loretta's pen stopped moving. She looked at the girl. She looked at the man. She looked at the girl again. "Daisy, honey," she said, "we need to take you somewhere safe." Hank heard himself speak before he'd decided to. "She is somewhere safe," he said. The words came out the way a bolt seats into a thread, without force, without drama, simply clicking into the place where they fit. He hadn't planned it. He didn't walk it back. Loretta held his gaze for a moment. "That's not your call to make, Mr. Mercer." "I know," Hank said, "but it's still true." She took Daisy 20 minutes later. The girl went without crying, without struggling. She handed Hank back the flannel jacket, folded with a neatness that stopped him cold, the sleeves tucked in, the collar aligned, and she walked to the county vehicle with the quiet, composed dignity of a child who has learned that resistance has consequences and compliance costs nothing except the thing you wanted. Hank stood in the doorway of his garage and watched the white Equinox move down Cedar Lane until its taillights turned the corner and disappeared. Then he went back inside. He picked up the folded flannel jacket from the camping chair and held it for a moment. It was still warm from her. He set it back down on the chair without unfolding it. He looked at the soft tail. He looked at the tools laid out on the workbench. He looked at the space heater still running in the corner, its orange coil glowing in the gray early light coming through the small garage window. He did not go back to work on the engine. He sat down on the milk crate and he thought about the way she had looked at him when she first looked up. Not with fear, not with hope, with something older and quieter than either of those things. The look of someone who had made a decision based on information other people couldn't see, and who was waiting with absolute patience to find out if the decision had been correct. He thought about the way she had folded the jacket. He thought about Loretta Vance opening the folder on the hood of her car before she drove away, and the way her face had shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, when she looked at something inside it. He didn't know what she had seen, but he had seen her see it. He pulled out his phone. It was 5:47 in the morning. He scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 2 years and looked at it for a long time. Carl Whitfield had handled Hank's divorce 7 years ago. He was a tall, thin man with a perpetually calm voice and an ability to absorb complicated situations without visible distress that Hank had always found either reassuring or unnerving, depending on the stakes. He was also the only person Hank knew who understood how systems worked. The paperwork systems, the court systems, the assessment systems that turned a man's life into a checklist and then judged him by what the checklist failed to capture. Hank pressed call. It rang 4 times. Then Carl's voice, thick with sleep and the particular irritation of a man whose phone has woken him before 6. Hank, it's not even 6 in the morning. I know, Hank said. Carl, I need your help with something. And I need you to not ask me if I'm sure. A pause. The sound of Carl sitting up. Tell me, Carl said. Hank told him all of it, from the sound at the garage door to the folded jacket on the camping chair. He told it plain, without editorializing, without asking for a reaction. When he was finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Hank, Carl said carefully, do you understand what you're talking about? Foster care proceedings, family court, a child who's already in a placement. I know what I'm talking about, Hank said. Another pause. Okay, Carl said. I'll be there in 2 days. Don't talk to anyone official without me present. Hank said he understood. He hung up. He set the phone face down on the workbench. Outside, Cedar Lane was beginning to stir. A porch light clicked off on a timer. A car backed out of a driveway 2 houses down. Somewhere at the end of the block, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning starting up, indifferent to what had passed in the small hours. Hank looked at the camping chair, at the flannel jacket still folded there, the way she had left it, at the mug on the shelf with Mercer Custom Mechanics on the side, and a ring of dried cocoa still at the bottom. He had lived in this garage, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. He had built it up, piece by piece, tool by tool, into a place that required nothing from him except precision and patience. A place where problems had solutions and the solutions made sense. A place where the silence was something he had chosen rather than something that had been left behind after everyone else had gone. For the first time in as long as he could measure, the silence felt like something other than peace. It felt like absence. He picked up the torque wrench, set it down again, picked up his coffee mug, set that down too. He sat on the milk crate in the gray October morning with his hands resting open on his knees, and he looked at the place where a 6-year-old girl had sat for 3 hours in the middle of the night in an oversized flannel jacket, holding a mug of hot chocolate with both hands, watching him with blue eyes that had already seen too much. She had walked past 4 houses to get to his door. He didn't know that yet. He would learn it later from the camera footage that Dennis Pruitt, 2 houses down, a man who had never once spoken to Hank beyond a nod across the driveway, would hand over to the sheriff's department as part of their investigation. The footage would show Daisy Crane standing at the end of 4 separate driveways in the dark, looking at 4 separate houses, and walking away from each one. It would show her standing at the base of his garage door for 40 seconds before she pressed herself against it and began to scratch at the metal. She had not stumbled into his garage. She had chosen it. He didn't know that yet, sitting in the early morning quiet of Cedar Lane with the October cold coming through the gaps in the garage walls and the space heater glowing orange in the corner. But somewhere in the part of himself that he had spent a lifetime refusing to listen to, the part that registered things before his mind had the words for them, he felt the weight of what had happened settling around him like a change in weather. Something had begun. He didn't yet know what it would cost him. He didn't yet know what it would give him back. He just sat there in the garage that had been his whole world and felt the walls of that world shift, quietly, irrevocably, a single degree. Carl Whitfield arrived 2 days later in a gray Ford pickup that was too practical for a lawyer and too old for someone who charged by the hour. He parked in the driveway, climbed out with his leather briefcase and a gas station coffee, and stood for a moment looking at the garage the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering a diagnosis, taking inventory, preparing the words. Hank had the side door open before Carl reached the gravel path. They shook hands the way men who have known each other since the age of 17 shake hands, briefly, without sentiment, with the kind of grip that communicates everything that won't be said out loud. Carl came inside, looked around the garage, and sat down on the milk crate without being invited. He had always been comfortable in spaces that weren't his. It was one of the things that made him a good lawyer and occasionally an exhausting friend. "Talk to me," Carl said. Hank told him everything again, all of it, in the same plain order he'd told it on the phone, but with the details that 2 days of thinking had sharpened. The way Daisy had looked at him when she first looked up. The folded jacket. The word she had used, Daisy, offered like something she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. The way she'd stood beside him when Loretta Vance came to take her, not grabbing, not crying, just standing there with her shoulder against his knee and her eyes on the social worker with an expression that was completely clear. Carl listened without interrupting. When Hank finished, Carl turned the gas station coffee cup slowly in his hands and looked at the floor. "I'll be honest with you, Hank," he said. "This is not going to be easy. You're a single man, 45 years old, no children, no foster care licensing, no parenting experience of any kind." He paused. "And your primary social presentation is, and I say this with genuine affection, alarming." "I know what I look like," Hank said. "It's not just what you look like. It's what people see when they look at you. And those are two different things, and only one of them matters in family court." Carl set the coffee down on the workbench. "The system is going to put you under a microscope. Everything you are, everything you've done, everything about the way you live is going to be examined by people who have already decided what they think before they knock on the door." "Then I'll let them look," Hank said. Carl studied him for a moment. "You understand what you're asking for? This isn't a one-time thing. This is inspections, interviews, background checks, a home study, supervised visitation, court appearances. This is months of your life." "I've got months," Hank said. Carl picked up his briefcase and opened it. "Then let's get started." The first inspection came 6 days after Daisy had been taken from the garage. Loretta Vance arrived on a Tuesday morning with a different clipboard than the one she'd carried before and the same measured expression. Hank had cleaned the house in the 2 days preceding. Not a performance of cleanliness, but a genuine reckoning with the state of a place that had been lived in by a man with no reason to maintain it beyond function. He threw out expired food from the pantry. He replaced the shower curtain. He bought sheets for the spare bedroom that weren't from the year of his marriage and stood in the doorway of that room for a long time afterward, looking at a bed that had been made for no one. He bought groceries he didn't know how to cook and a child's toothbrush at the pharmacy on Chapman Highway without entirely understanding why, since no one had told him to, and the young woman at the counter had looked at him the way young women at pharmacy counters sometimes look at large tattooed men purchasing children's toothbrushes, with an expression that tried very hard to be neutral and succeeded only partially. Loretta moved through the house with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had done this hundreds of times. She opened cabinets, she looked at window locks, she examined the bathroom, the kitchen, the back door. She opened the refrigerator and wrote something down. She asked about his income. Steady, irregular in the way all self-employment is irregular, but sufficient. She asked about his support network. Friends, she said. Some. From the shop, guys who bring bikes in. Family nearby? No. She made a note he couldn't read from where he was standing. He didn't need to read it. He knew what it said. He had been read that way his whole life. A list of deficits, a man assembled from things that weren't there rather than things that were. Loretta closed her notepad. She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd arrived. Mr. Mercer, she said, I want to be straightforward with you. My assessment at this stage identifies significant concerns, not about your character specifically, but about your circumstances. The department has protocols for a reason. I understand protocols, Hank said. I'm sure you do. She gathered her things. I'll be back. She came back twice more in the following 2 weeks, each time with different paperwork in the same expression. Hank cooperated with everything, completely and without complaint. He answered every question. He signed every form Carl told him to sign. He attended the mandatory orientation session for prospective foster guardians at the county office on Magnolia Avenue, sat through 3 hours of information delivered by a woman named Patricia, who spoke with the energy of someone teaching a class she genuinely believed in and did not once check his phone. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he drove to the Department of Children's Services office on East 5th Avenue for supervised visitation. The visits lasted 90 minutes each. A caseworker named Deb sat in the corner of the small visitation room with a notepad and the careful stillness of someone who had trained herself to be present without being intrusive. Daisy was always there when he arrived. She sat in the same plastic chair each time, in whatever clothes the group home had dressed her in that morning, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the door. When Hank walked in, she didn't run to him or call out. She just looked at him with those blue eyes, and something in her posture eased, a tension releasing from her shoulders that he could read from across the room, the slow unwinding of something that had been held too long under pressure. She was beginning to talk more, not in the rapid, associative way of children who feel entirely at ease, but steadily, carefully, the way someone talks when they've decided that words are worth the risk. She asked him about the Softail. She remembered it from the garage, the engine in pieces on the floor. He explained what he was doing to it in terms he thought a 6-year-old could follow, and she listened with a seriousness that made him think she was following more than he expected. She asked if motorcycles were loud. He said they could be. She said she didn't mind loud if it wasn't angry loud. He sat with that for a moment before he responded. This one's not angry loud, he said. It's more like satisfied loud. When the engine runs right, it sounds like it's glad. She considered this. Like purring. Exactly like that, he said. He brought her a drawing pad and colored pencils on the third visit, cleared it with Deb beforehand. Daisy took it with both hands and opened it on the table between them, and for the next 40 minutes she drew while he sat across from her and talked about the garage, about Tennessee in October, about the way the trees on Cedar Lane went red and gold every year, whether anyone was watching or not. She drew while he talked, and she listened while she drew. And Deb in the corner wrote things on her notepad that Hank could not see. What Hank did not know during those early weeks of inspections and paperwork and 90-minute visits was that the ground beneath his case was shifting in ways he couldn't observe. Carolyn Marsh had been teaching 3rd grade at Ridgeview Elementary for 11 years. She was 36 years old, had freckles across her nose that appeared every summer and faded every winter, and had developed over a decade of classroom experience the particular sensitivity of someone who has learned to read children the way other people read weather. Not by what they say, but by what they stop doing. Daisy Crane had stopped doing things. She had stopped raising her hand, stopped joining the other children at the activity tables during free periods, stopped eating in the cafeteria. The lunch monitor found her most days in a corner of the hallway outside the music room, eating alone with her back against the wall. She had stopped making eye contact with adults, stopped responding to her name on the first call, stopped producing the small spontaneous drawings that had covered the margins of her worksheets in the early weeks of the school year. Carolyn had flagged this in mid-September, before any of it, before the October night, before the garage, before Hank Mercer. She had submitted a welfare concern through the school district's standard process. She had followed up twice. She had received a form letter in response that told her the matter was under review. Then Daisy had disappeared from school for 2 weeks following the night on Cedar Lane, and when she returned, placed now in a group home in the North Knoxville district, riding a different bus, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit her, Carolyn had watched her walk through the classroom door and had felt something shift in her assessment of the situation. Daisy was different. Not better, not worse. Different in a way that was harder to categorize. She was still quiet. She still sat alone at lunch. But there was something that had come into her eyes that Carolyn recognized without immediately being able to name it. It was only later, watching Daisy draw in the margins of her math worksheet, two figures in front of a square building, that Carolyn identified it. It was orientation, the way a person looks when they know which direction they're facing. She asked Daisy casually as the class was putting things away at the end of the day what she'd drawn. "Me and Hank," Daisy said, as though this were self-evident. Carolyn called Loretta Vance that evening. She said, "I don't know what's happening in this case, and I understand there are things I'm not supposed to know. But I think you should be aware that Daisy mentions this man almost every day. She doesn't talk about much, but she talks about him. She says he made her hot chocolate. She says his jacket smelled like coffee. She says," Carolyn paused, choosing the emphasis carefully, "he didn't yell." Loretta was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "I'll make a note of it," she said. What Loretta didn't say was that the three words had landed somewhere specific inside her. He didn't yell. She had been doing this work for 23 years. She had learned early on that what children said about the adults in their lives was rarely dramatic. It was rarely about grand gestures or moments of obvious kindness. It was almost always about absence. Not what happened, but what didn't. He didn't yell. He didn't lie. He didn't leave. The note she made that evening was longer than her usual notes. Dennis Pruitt had opinions. He had always had opinions. It was, along with his lawn maintenance schedule and his certainty about the correct way to load a dishwasher, one of the defining characteristics of his existence on Cedar Lane. He was 58, worked in insurance, had 2 boys in middle school, and had lived 2 houses down from Hank Mercer for 4 years without once crossing the invisible boundary between them that both men had, without discussion, agreed to maintain. The morning after Daisy was taken, Dennis had checked his security camera footage for the previous night. He told himself he was checking for the package that had gone missing from his porch. He found the package. He also found 40 seconds of footage that showed a small girl in a pink nightgown standing at the base of Hank Mercer's garage door in the dark. He watched it 3 times. Then he called his brother-in-law, who called his neighbor, and by the time Dennis got to the hardware store that Saturday morning, the story had already arrived ahead of him. Slightly wrong, significantly embellished, and traveling at the speed of a community that has been given something to talk about. Dennis offered his version, which he believed was more accurate. He said what he thought, which was what many people on Cedar Lane thought, which was that something about a man like Hank Mercer receiving a child in his garage in the middle of the night did not sit right with him, and that the proper authorities had best look carefully at the situation. He said this at the hardware store. He said it at the diner on Chapman Highway. His wife said a version of it at the school pickup line. Hank heard about it indirectly, the way people in small communities hear about things that are being said about them. Through a shift in the air when he walked into the grocery store, through the way the woman at the post office counter handed him his mail without the small automatic pleasantry she usually produced, through the silence that fell over the 2 men talking by the truck beds in the Food City parking lot when he walked past. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, quietly, without visible reaction. He let it settle in the place where he kept the weight of other people's assessments, deep, where it could be ignored during working hours and acknowledged in the early mornings when sleep failed him. He was familiar with that place. He had been adding to it since he was a teenager, since the first time someone looked at him and saw the surface and decided the surface was the whole story. He did not go to Dennis Pruitt's house. He did not write a letter to the local paper. He went to his garage and worked on the Softail and showed up on Tuesday and Thursday for his 90 minutes with Daisy and did everything that was asked of him, correctly and on time, every single time. Then came November and Brenda Crane. Carl called him on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into the process, his voice carrying the particular quality it had when he was managing information carefully. Brenda Crane has filed an objection to your guardianship petition, Carl said. Hank was quiet. She's retained an attorney, Carl continued, a man named Gilmore out of Maryville. She's also made contact with someone at the Knoxville Sentinel. What does she want? Hank asked. Carl was quiet for a moment. Hank, Brenda Crane receives $1,400 a month in state foster care subsidy for Daisy. If Daisy is transferred to your guardianship, that subsidy ends. Hank sat with this for a long moment. He looked at the Softail, half assembled on the lift, the engine exposed with the careful openness of something that has been taken apart in order to be understood. She's doing this for the money, he said. That's not something we can prove directly, Carl said. What we can prove is that her attorney contacted the Knoxville Sentinel and provided a statement. It ran in this morning's edition. What does it say? Carl read it to him. It described Hank as a man with a prior criminal record who had made contact with a vulnerable child in the middle of the night under circumstances that remained unclear. It noted his isolated lifestyle, his unconventional appearance. It quoted Brenda Crane as saying she had serious concerns about any placement that would put her niece in the care of a man she didn't know, in a garage at 3 a.m. Hank listened to the whole thing. When Carl finished reading, the line was quiet. What do you need me to do? Hank said. Nothing differently than what you're already doing, Carl said. Show up, cooperate. Don't react to the article publicly. Let the record speak. Hank said he understood. After he hung up, he went to the machine in the corner, poured the last of the evening's coffee, and stood at his workbench. He thought about the $1,400 a month. He thought about a woman who had filed a missing persons report at 1 a.m. and whose report had listed Daisy's physical description accurately and her emotional state as stable. He thought about what stable meant when a 6-year-old walked 16 miles barefoot in October rather than spend another night in the house where she was supposedly safe. He drank the coffee. He went back to work on the engine. The article ran on a Thursday. By Saturday, 2 more people on Cedar Lane had stopped making eye contact. By the following Tuesday, a man Hank had serviced bikes for over 3 years called to cancel a scheduled appointment without explanation. Hank rescheduled it for another week and didn't mention the article. He kept going to the visitation room on East Fifth Avenue. He kept showing up, and Daisy kept being there when he arrived. It was the 8th visit, a Thursday in early December. The windows of the visitation room hazed with condensation from the heating system when Daisy said something that changed the coordinates of everything. She was drawing. She had been drawing for about 20 minutes, working on something she was keeping turned away from him, which was new. Usually she drew with the pad flat on the table between them. Today she had it angled toward her chest, and she worked with the focused concentration of someone who doesn't want the thing to be seen until it's finished. Hank was talking about the Softail. He'd gotten the primary drive reassembled, he said. The first time he turned it over, the engine caught and held and produced a sound that settled into the bones of a person who knows machines. The particular note of an engine that has finally found its rhythm, steady and sure and glad. Daisy put her pencil down. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked at him. Can I tell you something? She asked. Yeah, he said. You can tell me anything. She looked at the table again. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it always was. Quiet, careful, each word placed deliberately. At Aunt Brenda's. She didn't hurt me. A pause. Not like hitting. Hank stayed completely still. But every night, Daisy said, when she turned off the light, she would say, she stopped, swallowed, started again. She would say, you're not mine. Don't expect to belong here. The room was very quiet. The heating system ticked. Deb's pen had stopped moving in the corner. She said it every night? Hank asked. Daisy nodded. Until I knew it. Hank looked at her. At this child who had walked 16 miles in October in a pink nightgown with no shoes, who had stood at 4 driveways and walked away from all of them, who had sat in a camping chair in his garage at 3 a.m. with her feet dangling above the concrete and held a mug of hot chocolate with both hands and told him her name like it was something fragile. He understood now why she had walked. Some things don't leave bruises. Some things don't show up on assessment forms or in the boxes that Loretta Vance checked on her clipboard. Some things work differently than that. They work the way water works on stone, not by force but by repetition, wearing away the surface over time until the shape of the thing beneath has changed. "You're not mine. Don't expect to belong here," said every night, until a 6-year-old knew it. "Daisy," he said. His voice was level. He was careful with it. "That was wrong. What she said to you was wrong. You understand me?" She looked at him. "You belong somewhere," he said. "That hasn't changed. That's not something that someone saying the wrong thing can take away." Daisy held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and turned the drawing pad around. Two figures, one large, one small, standing in front of a square shape with a big door. The large figure had brown and gray scribbles around its face. The small figure had yellow lines for hair. Between them, in the careful, oversized letters of a child who has worked on every curve, the word "safe." In the corner of the room, Deb set down her notepad and picked up her phone. What she filed that evening was not a standard observation report. It was a supplemental disclosure. What Daisy had said, quoted directly, time-stamped, with the notation that this information had not previously appeared in any case documentation associated with the crane placement. She sent it to Loretta Vance's direct email at 7:48 in the evening. Loretta read it at 8:15, sitting at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She read it twice. Then she opened the original placement file for Brenda and Terry Crane, the one that had been submitted when Daisy was placed with them 4 months earlier. She found the welfare assessment. She found the home visit notes. She found the monthly check-in reports, all of them filed on time, all of them noting that Daisy was adjusting well, that the placement was stable, that the environment was appropriate. She found the report filed 3 weeks before Daisy walked away in the middle of the night. It said, "Child appears calm and settled, transition progressing normally." Loretta took her glasses off and set them on the table. She sat for a long time in her kitchen in the quiet of a December evening, and she thought about 23 years of cases and the ways in which a form can be technically accurate and entirely false at the same time. She thought about Daisy standing at 4 driveways and walking away. She thought about what information a 6-year-old uses to make that kind of decision. Not physical safety. She hadn't been struck, hadn't been starved. Something else. Something about the quality of the space. Something about what a place feels like when it tells you, every night in the dark, that you are not wanted. She put her glasses back on and opened a new document. She began writing. Carolyn Marsh made her decision in the second week of January, on a Friday afternoon, in the parking lot of Ridgeview Elementary, sitting in her car for 20 minutes after everyone else had gone because she needed to be sure. The letter from the administration had arrived that Tuesday. It was professional and careful, and it said, in the measured language of people who are trying to avoid saying something directly, that staff were advised against involvement in ongoing legal matters pertaining to students, that the district had protocols for welfare reporting, and those protocols had been followed, and that any additional involvement by individual staff members could create liability for the school and complexity for the family court process. It did not say stay out of it. It said everything else possible and trusted her to understand. Carolyn sat in the parking lot on that Friday afternoon and thought about Daisy drawing 2 figures in front of a garage. She thought about the words safe in oversized crayon letters. She thought about the 11 years she'd spent in this job, in the particular responsibility of being the adult in a room full of children who could not advocate for themselves. Then she picked up her phone and called Carl Whitfield. "I understand there may be professional risk involved," she said, when Carl had listened to what she had to say. "I'm not withdrawing." Carl was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Marsh, I want to be clear about what voluntary testimony in a family court proceeding could mean for your—" "I'm not withdrawing," she said again. Within a week, the story had traveled. Not because anyone had planned it to. Carolyn hadn't called the paper, hadn't posted anything, hadn't done anything beyond making a single phone call to an attorney. But a teacher risking her job to testify in a custody case involving a tattooed motorcycle mechanic and a 6-year-old girl who'd walked 16 miles in the middle of the night was a story that moved on its own, the way certain stories do, finding the channels of a community and running through them quietly until it arrived everywhere at once. By the end of January, the hearing date, February 14th, was something that 300 people in Knoxville knew about. No one organized them. No one sent a notice. They simply decided one by one and in small groups that they wanted to be there. Hank didn't know about any of this. He spent January the way he'd spent November and December, working the garage, making the drive to East Fifth Avenue twice a week, cooperating with every requirement, answering every question from Loretta Vance's ongoing assessment with the same plain accuracy he'd brought to the first interview. He refinished the spare bedroom floor on a weekend in mid-January, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the floor had needed refinishing since before the divorce, and he had finally run out of reasons not to do it. He stood in the doorway of the finished room afterward and looked at it for a long time. The floor was good oak, warm-toned, with the grain running toward the window the way good floors should. He had bought a lamp for the nightstand, a simple one with a warm bulb. He had bought a copy of Charlotte's Web at the used bookstore on Gay Street because it was the book he remembered most from being a child, the one his mother had read to him in a voice that made even the sad parts feel held. He stood in the doorway of that room and felt the particular weight of something that has been prepared for but not yet arrived. The night before the hearing, he sat in the garage until after midnight, not working, just sitting on the milk crate in the low light, with the soft tail on the lift and the radio off and the February cold pressing at the walls. He took the drawing out of his shirt pocket. He had carried it there since the 8th visit, folded in a square, the same pocket where he kept his phone and his keys, the things he checked for before walking out the door. He unfolded it carefully on his knee. 2 figures in front of a garage, yellow hair, gray-brown beard. The words safe in letters that leaned slightly to the left because the hand that wrote them was still learning which way letters went. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about what Carl had said in November. Let the record speak. He had let the record speak for 4 months. He had shown up and cooperated and answered questions and signed forms and sat in plastic chairs in county offices and done everything that was asked of him without flinching. The record was what it was. But sitting in the garage the night before the hearing, Hank wasn't thinking about the record. He was thinking about something Carl had not coached him on, something no amount of legal preparation could address. He was thinking about whether he was the right person for this. Not legally. He understood that was Carl's domain. He was thinking about it the way a man thinks about it at midnight when there's no one to perform certainty for. Honestly, without the language of advocacy, just the bare question sitting in the space between him and the wall. He was 45 years old. He had spent 7 years building a life-sized exactly for one. He was not patient in the ways that people who work with children are patient. The warm, expansive, endlessly renewable patience of someone who has chosen proximity to children as their vocation. His patience was a different kind. The patience of a man who has learned to wait for things that matter and let go of things that don't. Was that enough? He looked at the drawing, at the 2 figures standing in front of the garage, at the small hand that had placed them there, slightly too close together for the composition to be accidental. Daisy had known something standing at the end of those 4 driveways in the dark. She had processed information that Hank couldn't fully account for, and she had arrived at an answer. She had been 6 years old, alone in October, and she had made a decision with more clarity than most adults managed in conditions of far greater comfort. He thought, she was right about the garage. She was right that it was safe. He thought, the only question that matters is whether I'm going to be what she already decided I am. He folded the drawing carefully and put it back in his shirt pocket. He sat in the garage until the February cold drove him inside. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the ceiling and didn't sleep much. At 5 in the morning, he went back to the garage. Not to work, just to be there. In the space where it had started. In the particular quality of light and cold, in the smell of engine grease and old coffee that was, for better or for worse, the whole of what he had to offer. At 7, he went inside and put on the white button-down shirt Carl had made him buy. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, looking at himself. The beard, the lines, the collar that felt like a costume. He thought about taking the collar off. He left it on. He drove to the Knox County Courthouse on Main Street in the February morning and walked through the front doors and found 300 people looking back at him. Hank had been inside the Knox County Courthouse before. Once, 22 years ago, for the DUI hearing that had cost him his license for 14 months and introduced him to the particular humiliation of asking people for rides. Once for the divorce proceedings, sitting across a table from Paula and two attorneys in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner, signing his name to the end of something. He knew the building, the marble floors, the fluorescent lighting, the smell of old paper and institutional coffee that no government building in America had ever successfully eliminated. He was not prepared for what he walked into. The hallway outside courtroom 4 was full. Not the ordinary fullness of a busy morning, people moving through, checking phones, waiting for their names to be called, but the stillness of people who had come somewhere specific and intended to stay. They lined both walls of the corridor. They stood near the water fountain, near the stairwell door, near the window at the end of the hall where the February light came in flat and gray. Some of them Hank recognized. The woman from the pharmacy on Chapman Highway, the man who ran the auto parts counter at the O'Reilly on Magnolia, a few faces from the diner. Most of them he had never seen before in his life. They looked at him when he came through the door. He kept walking. Carl was waiting outside the courtroom, his briefcase open on a bench, a legal pad balanced on his knee. He looked up when Hank approached and did a single, controlled assessment of Hank's appearance that took approximately 2 seconds. "Good," Carl said. "The shirt works. How are you?" "Fine," Hank said. "The room is full. I want you to know that before we go in." "I can see the hall is full. The room is fuller." Carl closed the briefcase. "Don't look at the crowd when you walk in. Look at the table. Sit down. Look at me or look at the judge. Don't look for Daisy until you're seated." "Where is she?" "She's already inside with her caseworker. Front row, left side." Carl stood. "Hank, whatever happens in there, you've done everything right. The record is clean. Let me do the arguing. You just answer what you're asked." Hank nodded. They went in. The courtroom held 80 people comfortably. Today it held more than 3 times that number. Every bench was packed to its capacity and beyond, people sitting shoulder to shoulder with the compressed patience of those who have arrived early and claimed their space. More stood along both side walls, lined up with their arms at their sides or folded across their chests. The sound when Hank entered was the particular sound of a large group of people making the effort not to make noise, a low, held breath quality that was more present than silence. Hank looked at the table. He sat down. He looked at Carl. Then, because he couldn't help it, he looked at the front row. She was there, sitting in the aisle seat, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a dark blue sweater that was slightly too big for her and had the institutional quality of something chosen from a donated clothing closet. Her hair was clean and brushed. Her feet, in white sneakers, were parallel to the floor. Not swinging, not still, just waiting, the way the rest of her was waiting. The caseworker beside her, a young woman named Angie whom Hank had met twice during the supervised visits, sat with her own hands folded and her eyes forward. Daisy was looking at the door through which Hank had just come. When their eyes met, she didn't smile. She didn't wave. She did the thing she always did. Something in her posture eased, not dramatically, just the small release of a body that has confirmed what it already knew. And she turned to face the front of the courtroom with the same patient stillness she had carried since the night she'd appeared on his driveway. She had known he would come. Judge Ronald Voss entered at 9 o'clock exactly. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with steel gray hair cut short, and a face that had accumulated the particular kind of lines that come from spending decades in a room where people bring their worst situations and expect resolution. He moved to the bench with the unhurried certainty of someone who has learned that a calm entrance sets the temperature of everything that follows. He surveyed the room. Both eyebrows rose fractionally at the crowd. He sat down, opened the file in front of him, and called the case without commenting on the attendance. Loretta Vance was called first. She took the stand with the same measured efficiency she brought to everything. Her notepad on her knee, her reading glasses on their chain. The county attorney, a woman named Hargrove, who had the clip precision of someone who valued time, led her through the assessment process. The home visits, the background check, the supervised visitation observations, the risk evaluation framework. Loretta answered in the language of her profession, careful and exact, neither flattering to Hank nor unfair. She listed the concerns: single male, no parenting experience, limited social support network, unconventional lifestyle, prior criminal record. She listed them in the same tone she might list the weather forecast. Not with satisfaction, not with apology, simply as the facts they were. Then Hargrove asked, "In your professional assessment, Mrs. Vance, what changed over the course of your evaluation?" Loretta was quiet for a moment. "Several things, Barrow," she said. Mr. Mercer complied with every requirement of the assessment process without exception. He was never late for a scheduled inspection or interview. He never failed to produce requested documentation. He completed the orientation requirements without being reminded. These are not unusual things in isolation, but the consistency over 4 months, without a single lapse, is... She paused. It tells you something about a person's commitment, that their behavior doesn't change when they think no one is paying particular attention. And the child? Hargrove asked. Loretta looked at her notepad, then looked up without consulting it. Daisy Crane demonstrates, in my professional observation, a level of trust in Mr. Mercer that is uncommon. In children who have experienced what Daisy has experienced, repeated displacement, emotional neglect, environments of instability, the development of secure attachment is significantly impaired. It takes time. It takes consistency. It takes a particular quality of presence from the adult. She paused again. Daisy does not extend trust easily. When she extends it, it means something. I've learned over 23 years to take that seriously. Thank you, Mrs. Vance. Hargrove sat down. The attorney for Brenda Crane was a man named Gilmore. He was in his late 40s, compact and careful in his movements, with the groomed confidence of a man who won more cases than he lost and knew how to use a pause. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and approached the stand with an expression of professional courtesy that contained underneath it something with an edge. Mrs. Vance, he said, you've testified that Mr. Mercer's compliance record is strong. I want to ask you about the period before compliance was required, the night of October 9th, when a 6-year-old child appeared at Mr. Mercer's residence at 3 in the morning. Yes, Loretta said. Mr. Mercer lives alone, keeps unconventional hours, has no family connections in the area. Would it be accurate to say that on the night in question, there were no witnesses to what occurred in that garage between Mr. Mercer and this child prior to law enforcement's arrival? The deputies arrived within 20 minutes of Mr. Mercer's call, Loretta said. The child showed no signs of harm. That wasn't my question. Were there witnesses? No. Gilmore nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd long suspected. Thank you. He sat down. The implication hung in the air the way implications do when they've been placed there carefully. Not said, not provable, but present, floating at the edge of the room's attention. Hank felt it land. He kept his face where Carl had told him to keep it, forward, steady, toward the judge. Carolyn Marsh took the stand next. She was composed in the way of someone who has made a decision they intend to stand behind regardless of the weather. And there was something in her posture, a kind of deliberate uprightness, that communicated this to the room before she said a word. She spoke about Daisy's behavior at Ridgeview Elementary in the weeks before October 9th. The withdrawal, the silence, the lunches alone in the hallway. She described it with the precision of someone who has observed children for years and knows the difference between ordinary shyness and something that runs deeper. Then she described what she had observed after Daisy's supervised visits with Hank began. She started drawing again, Carolyn said. That was the first thing, the margins of her worksheets. She'd always done that before. October, and then it stopped. After the third or fourth visit, it came back. She paused. She started eating in the cafeteria. She started making eye contact when I addressed her. She answered a question in class in November, voluntarily without being called on, for the first time since September. Did she speak about Mr. Mercer? Hargrove asked. Almost every day, Carolyn said. She doesn't talk a great deal in general, but she talks about him. She told me he explained how an engine works. She told me his garage smells like coffee. She told me. Carolyn stopped for a moment. When she continued, her voice was the same, but something behind it had shifted. She told me he didn't yell. Those were the specific words she used. He didn't yell. The courtroom was quiet. In 11 years of teaching, Carolyn said, I've learned that children tell you what matters to them by what they choose to mention. Daisy chose to mention that. 3 words. He didn't yell. That's what safety looked like to her. Gilmore's cross-examination of Carolyn was brief and pointed. He noted that she had been advised by her school administration against involvement in the proceedings. He asked whether she understood she was acting contrary to that guidance. She said she understood. He asked whether she believed her personal assessment of the situation was more reliable than the institutional protocols designed to protect children. She said she believed it was consistent with them. He sat down. The child psychologist who had evaluated Daisy, a quiet man named Dr. Fletcher, who wore bow ties and spoke with the careful specificity of someone for whom language was a precision instrument, testified about attachment patterns in children who have experienced early instability. He described Daisy's profile. He described what healthy attachment development looked like, how it manifested, what conditions supported it. He did not speak about Hank directly. He described in clinical terms what the supervised visit observation suggested about the quality of connection between the child and the adult she was visiting. In your professional opinion, Hargrove asked, what is the likely outcome for Daisy Crane if this connection is disrupted? Dr. Fletcher looked at the file. Children with Daisy's attachment history who form significant bonds and then have those bonds removed. The literature is consistent. The disruption reinforces the child's existing model of relationships as unreliable. The damage is cumulative. It becomes harder, not easier, to form stable connections over time. He paused. She found something. That's not a given for children in her situation. It's not even common. Removing it requires a substantial justification. Then it was Gilmore's turn to present Brenda Crane's case. Brenda did not testify in person. Gilmore had arranged this strategically. Her absence was a choice, not an absence of something to say, and everyone in the room who understood how these proceedings worked understood that. Instead, Gilmore presented her written statement and called a single witness, a family services coordinator from the county who testified about standard placement protocols and the importance of biological family connections in foster care situations. Then Gilmore stood for his closing argument. He was good. Hank recognized it, sitting at the respondent's table, the way he could recognize good mechanical work in an engine someone else had built. The precision of fit, the absence of waste. Gilmore was not crude. He did not attack Hank directly. He built his argument the way a careful man builds anything, from the foundation up, piece by piece, each piece fitting the next. He acknowledged that the testimony had been compelling. He acknowledged that Daisy appeared to have formed a meaningful connection. He acknowledged that Mr. Mercer's compliance record was, as Mrs. Vance had testified, consistent. Then he asked a question. Your Honor, he said to him, the court has heard a great deal today about what Daisy needs, about what she responds to, about what makes her feel safe. And I want to be clear. No one in this room disputes that Daisy Crane deserves safety. No one disputes that she deserves stability. He paused, and the pause was the kind that fills itself. But I want to ask the court to consider a question that has not been fully answered in today's testimony. A 45-year-old man, living alone, no children, no parenting experience of any kind, no established support network. He receives a child in his garage at 3 in the morning, and 4 months later he is petitioning the court for legal guardianship. Another pause. I want to ask, Why? Why this child? Why this man? The court has heard a great deal about Daisy's attachment to Mr. Mercer. I would ask the court to consider what has produced that attachment. I would ask the court to ask the question that hasn't been asked today. Why does a man like this want this particular child? He sat down. The room was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when something has been placed in a space and everyone present understands that the space has changed. Not because the argument was convincing, Hank could see from Carl's posture that Carl had a response prepared, a clean and probably effective legal response. But because the question, said plainly in a packed courtroom in front of 300 people, had pointed at something that everyone in the room could feel, the gap between what Hank looked like and what was being asked of the court to believe about him. Carl began to rise. Judge Voss held up one hand. "I'll hear from Mr. Mercer." Carl glanced at Hank. Hank was already standing. He walked to the witness stand with the same walk he used everywhere. Steady, unhurried, taking up the space he took up without apology or performance. He sat down. He looked at Carl, who gave him a single small nod. He had notes, 3 pages, covered in Carl's handwriting, the prepared answers to the prepared questions, the language Carl had coached him on over 3 evenings in the garage. He looked at the notes. He looked at the 300 people arranged in the wooden benches of a courtroom that had never been designed to hold them. He looked at Judge Voss, who was watching him with the expression of a man who had heard a great many answers to a great many questions and could tell the difference between a prepared one and a true one. He looked at Daisy, front row, left side, hands folded, blue eyes on him, shoulders level. He set the notes on the edge of the stand. "I'm going to try to answer his question," Hank said. His voice was rough. He didn't work to smooth it. "The why question, because it's a fair question. I've asked it myself." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm the right person on paper. I know what the paper says. Single man, 45, no kids, tattoos, a DUI from 22 years ago, lives alone in a garage in East Knoxville. I know what that looks like. I've known what it looks like my whole life." He stopped. The courtroom was completely still. "I'm not asking you to see past that. I'm asking you to see what's also true." He turned slightly toward the judge. "That little girl walked past 4 houses to get to my door. She was 6 years old. It was 3 in the morning in October, and she had no shoes, and she had been walking a long time, and she walked past 4 houses with porch lights on and welcome mats, and she stopped at mine." He paused. "I have spent 4 months trying to understand why she picked me. I don't have an answer that would satisfy a court. I don't have credentials. I don't have a framework. What I have is this. She wasn't wrong." He said it plainly, not as argument, as fact. She was safe in that garage. She has been safe every minute I have been in the room with her. She is always going to be safe with me. Not because I'm perfect. I am not anywhere close to perfect. But because she matters more to me than anything I have ever held in my hands. And I have held a lot of engines. And I know the difference between something you're careful with because you're supposed to be and something you're careful with because you cannot afford to let it break. He let that sit for a moment. "The why question," he said. "Why does a man like me want this particular child?" He looked at Gilmore briefly, without hostility. "Because she chose me. I have been a lot of things in my life. I have not been chosen. Not like that. Not by someone who had nothing to gain from it and no reason to do it except that something in her, something that 6 years of being moved around and told she didn't belong hadn't killed yet, said this is the place." He stopped again. His jaw was tight. He didn't look away from the judge. "I'm not going to waste that. I'm asking this court not to waste it either." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all I have, Your Honor. I'm not a speech guy. I just—" He glanced at Daisy. "She's mine. Not legally. Not on any form. But she is. And I'm asking you to let me take care of her." He picked up the notes, which he had not used, and walked back to the respondent's table. The courtroom did not make a sound. 300 people sat in the kind of silence that follows something that cannot be responded to. The silence of a room that has heard something true and has no appropriate reaction except stillness. Carl put his hand on Hank's shoulder briefly, then withdrew it. Hank sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes forward. Then Carl stood. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit Plaintiff's Exhibit C into evidence." He walked to the bench and handed up a clear plastic sleeve. Inside it was a piece of drawing paper, slightly worn at the fold lines, with a crayon drawing on it. Two figures in front of a building, yellow hair and gray-brown scribbles, and in the uneven, slightly leftward-leaning letters of a child still learning their direction. The words "safe." Judge Voss took it from the sleeve carefully. He looked at it for a long moment. The courtroom looked at him looking at it. Loretta Vance in the gallery set her pen down. Carolyn Marsh pressed two fingers to her mouth. In the back of the room, Dennis Pruitt, who had come because his wife had asked him to, and who had spent most of the morning with his arms folded, slowly unfolded them. Judge Voss set the drawing on the bench in front of him. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," he said. "I'll have my decision when we reconvene." The 30 minutes passed the way certain spans of time pass, not quickly or slowly, but in a category outside duration, a suspended interval where the normal movement of things has paused and everyone present is simply existing within the pause. The hallway filled again with the people who had been inside. Conversations were low and brief. People stood near windows. Some of them didn't speak at all. Carl stayed close to Hank but didn't talk. There was nothing left to prepare. The case had been made. What happened next was outside both of their jurisdictions. Hank stood near the window at the end of the hall and looked at the February street below. The sky was the color of old pewter. A few people moved along the sidewalk, heads down in the cold, going about the ordinary motion of a Thursday in February, unaware that 30 feet above them, in a building designed for the resolution of broken things, something was being decided. He thought about the spare bedroom, the refinished floor, the lamp on the nightstand, the copy of Charlotte's Web on the shelf. He thought about the words "safe" in letters that leaned slightly left because the hand that wrote them was still learning. He thought, whatever happens in the next 30 minutes, she was right about the garage. Whatever happens, that night happened. Whatever happens, she was warm and she had hot chocolate and no one yelled and she folded the jacket when she left. Whatever happened next, that was already true and would remain true. He thought, I hope it's enough. When Judge Voss returned, the room resettled itself in under a minute. 300 people reclaiming seats and wall space with the wordless efficiency of people who have been waiting for something and do not intend to miss it. Voss sat. He opened the file. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up. "I've reviewed all testimony, all documentation, all submitted evidence in this matter," he said. "I want to acknowledge the thoroughness of Mrs. Vance's evaluation and the candor of all witnesses who testified today." He removed his reading glasses, a gesture Hank had noticed earlier, the gesture that preceded personal rather than procedural speech. Family court serves a single purpose: the best interest of the child, not the best interest of the system, not the best interest of what looks correct on paper, the best interest of the child who is present in this courtroom. He looked at Daisy. She looked back at him. Both hands still folded, both feet still parallel to the floor, not quite reaching it. "I have read the assessments. I have heard the testimony. I have looked at a crayon drawing that will stay in my mind longer than most things that have come through this courtroom." He set his glasses down. "What strikes me about this case is not any single piece of evidence, but the picture that all of it makes together. A child who was not safe became safe. A man who was not trusted became trustworthy, not because either of them changed who they are, because they were given the conditions to be seen clearly." He put his glasses back on and looked at Hank directly. "Mr. Mercer, This court is granting you temporary legal guardianship of Elena Grace Crane, effective immediately, subject to a review hearing in 6 months and ongoing monitoring by the Department of Children's Services. He held Hank's gaze. Based on everything I have heard and seen today, I believe this child belongs with you. The sound that moved through the courtroom was not applause. It was larger than applause and quieter. It was the sound of 300 people exhaling at the same moment, a collective release of something that had been held through 4 months of inspections and articles and doubt, and a 30-minute recess, and a question from a lawyer in a good suit that had pointed at the worst possible interpretation of a simple human fact. The sound rose and fell like a wave, and then settled. And in the settling, there was something that felt, to the people in the room, like the resolution of a cord that had been suspended for a long time. Hank did not move. He sat at the respondent's table with his hands flat on the wood surface and his jaw set and his eyes on the judge, and he heard the words again in his head, "I believe this child belongs with you." And he sat with them the way he sat with things that were too large to immediately process, holding them still, letting them become real by degrees. Carl's hand was on his shoulder again. Hank barely felt it. Then Daisy moved. She slid off the bench in the front row. She stepped past Angie, who reached out instinctively, and then let her hand fall. She walked past the case file table, past the end of the attorney's row, past Loretta Vance with her canvas tote and her notepad, through the small gate in the bar that separated the gallery from the court floor. She walked across the open space of the courtroom floor in her too big blue sweater and her white sneakers, with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has known for some time. She stopped in front of Hank. She looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was entirely still. Hank looked at her, at the clean blonde hair and the blue eyes, and the small, composed face of a child who had made a decision in the dark and had turned out to be right. And something broke through every wall he had ever constructed with his particular brand of silence and distance, and the practiced indifference of a man who has decided it's easier not to want things. All of it gave way. Quietly, completely. The way things give way when the thing they were protecting against has already arrived and there is no longer any structural purpose to the wall. He came off the chair and went down on one knee on the courtroom floor. His knees cracked, the same way they had on his gravel driveway in October, in the cold. The same sound in a different room. Some things about a man don't change, regardless of what room he's in. Daisy stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. She was small and she held on with everything she had, her fingers gripping the fabric of the white button-down shirt, her face pressed into his shoulder, her whole small body leaning into him with the unself-conscious completeness of someone who has finally set down something they've been carrying for a very long time. He put his arms around her carefully, then less carefully. He held on. "We going home?" she said against his shoulder. Her voice was very small. "Yeah," Hank said. His voice broke on the word. He did not try to hide it. "We're going home." In the back of the courtroom, Dennis Pruitt stood up. He didn't say anything. He didn't lead anything. He just stood there for a moment. This man who had watched his neighbor across 4 years of nodded non-acknowledgement, who had shared the camera footage and the opinions and the sidelong assessments, watching Hank Mercer kneel on a courtroom floor and hold a 6-year-old girl as if she were the most important thing in the world, which was because she was. Dennis stood for a moment. Then he walked out through the courtroom doors and into the February afternoon where the sun had broken through the pewter sky for the first time all day, thin and cold and real. He went home. He found his 2 boys in the backyard throwing a football in the cold, their breath making small clouds in the February air. He stood on the back porch and watched them for a long while without saying anything. He watched the way they moved, the easy physicality of boys who have never once wondered whether they were wanted, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with recognition. Then he went inside. He found a piece of paper and wrote something on the back of a hardware store receipt that was sitting on the counter by the door. He read what he had written. He folded it once. Then he put on his jacket and walked 2 houses down Cedar Lane in the February cold and turned into the open garage. And he crossed to the workbench and set the folded note down and weighted it with a socket wrench so it wouldn't move. It said, "I was wrong about you. Sorry. Dennis." He walked back home without looking back. In the courthouse hallway, as the crowd moved toward the exits in the noise of 300 people reclaiming their Thursday afternoon, Loretta Vance found Hank near the water fountain. She was not carrying her clipboard. She had her canvas tote on her shoulder and her reading glasses in her hand, and for the first time since Hank had met her, she looked like a woman rather than a professional. The same person, but without the armor of function. Something in her face had the open quality of a thing that has been decided. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Mercer," she said, then stopped, started again. "I want to say something to you that isn't in any report." Hank waited. "When I came to your garage the morning of October 10th, she said, "I had assessed you before I finished my first cup of coffee. I had filed you somewhere that made my job easier. That's—" She paused. "That's a thing you can do for 23 years and forget that you're doing it. And I was wrong. What I saw wasn't what was there." She held his gaze steadily, the way a person does when they've made up their mind to say a hard thing all the way through. "Daisy wasn't wrong about you. I was. I want you to know that I know that." Hank looked at her for a moment. "You kept going," he said. "After you knew. That's what matters." Loretta held his gaze a moment longer. Then she nodded once, put her glasses back on, and walked toward the exit with her canvas tote and her 23 years and the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from having been wrong about something important and chosen to say so out loud. They drove home in Hank's truck, Daisy in the passenger seat with her seatbelt fastened and her hands resting in her lap, watching Cedar Lane through the window as they turned onto it. She looked at the houses going past, the porch lights, the driveways, the stop sign at the corner with its cracked and yellowed neighborhood watch placard. And she said nothing. And Hank didn't fill the silence because by now they both understood that the silence between them didn't need filling. He parked in the driveway. The garage light was still on from that morning. Through the small window, the orange glow of the space heater was visible in the corner, still running. They sat for a moment in the cab of the truck. "You want to see your room?" he asked. She turned from the window and looked at him with those blue eyes that had, in the 4 months since October, lost some of their oldest exhaustion and gained something else, something younger, more provisional, still deciding what to do with itself. "I have a room," she said. "You have a room," he said. They went inside. He showed her the spare bedroom, the refinished oak floor, warm-toned and smooth, the grain running toward the window the way good floors should. The lamp on the nightstand with its warm bulb making a small circle of light in the February dusk. The window that faced the backyard where the trees along the fence line were bare and stark in February and would be something else entirely when April arrived. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it without going in. The way people look at things they need a moment to accept are real. Then she walked to the nightstand and picked up Charlotte's Web and turned it over in her hands, looking at the cover. She studied it with the serious attention she gave to most things. "It's a good book," Hank said from the doorway. "Did you read it?" "When I was about your age, my mother read it to me." She looked at the book, then at him. "Can you read it to me?" Something moved through him quietly, without announcement, the way certain things arrive, not dramatically, but with the specific weight of something that has been absent for a long time and has finally come back. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." The first 3 days settled into a shape that neither of them had designed or planned. Daisy woke early, earlier than Hank, who had not in 45 years been an early riser outside of mechanical necessity. And he would find her at the kitchen table with her drawing pad open and a pencil moving when he came down at 6:30. He made coffee without speaking. He made her oatmeal with brown sugar, which she ate in the methodical, unhurried way she did most things, working from one side of the bowl to the other with the pencil still in her free hand in case an idea arrived between bites. She watched him move around the kitchen with the same careful attention she had given him in the garage in October, cataloging and noting, building her understanding of a person the way she built her drawings, one line at a time, nothing rushed. On the second morning, while the oatmeal was cooling, she set the pencil down and looked at him across the table. "Is it fixed yet?" she asked. He looked up from his coffee. "Is what fixed?" The motorcycle. Almost, he said. She nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she had expected. Then, can I watch? He looked at her across the kitchen table, at this small, serious person in her pajamas with the pencil still behind her ear, and he felt the corner of his mouth move in a way it hadn't moved in a long time. You want to watch me work on an engine? She nodded, practical and certain. Okay, he said. So she brought the camping chair from its corner and positioned it where she could see the whole lift. And she sat in it the same way she had sat in it in October, both hands around the warm mug, feet not reaching the floor. Except that now she had socks on and the slippers he'd bought at the pharmacy on Chapman Highway, and the hot chocolate was made from the good kind, not the packets. Because he had gone to the grocery store with a list for the first time in years and come back with things a child might want. She sat and watched him work on the primary drive reassembly with the focused quiet of someone who is genuinely interested and has learned that questions are welcome when the time is right. He narrated what he was doing without being asked. She listened without interrupting. At one point, he set down a socket wrench and reached for the torque wrench and glanced over to find her with the drawing pad open on her knee, sketching the engine from her angle, the lines careful and observant, catching the shape of the Harley's engine with more accuracy than he would have expected from a 6-year-old who had never been shown how to look at machines. He went back to work without saying anything. He didn't want to make a thing of it. She would tell him what she saw when she was ready. That was how she worked. He was beginning to understand that this was a child who did not offer things until she was certain they would be received, and that the right response to being trusted was not to perform gratitude for it, but simply to be worthy of the next time. On the second evening, he read to her. The first chapter of Charlotte's Web, sitting in the chair beside her bed, the lamp making the room warm while the February dark pressed at the window. He used his own voice, which was rough and not designed for reading aloud, and Daisy lay on her side with her knees pulled up and her eyes serious, following every word. When he reached the end of the chapter, she was quiet for a moment. Is Charlotte nice? She asked. Yeah, Hank said. She's one of the best. Daisy considered this. How do you know she's nice and not just useful? Hank thought about it. Because she does more than she has to, he said. She could have just been a spider. She chose to be something else. Daisy was quiet again for a long moment. Then she pulled the blanket up to her chin and looked at the ceiling. Okay, she said. That makes sense. He turned off the overhead light and left the door open the way she'd asked, just enough for the hallway light to make a thin gold line across the floor of her room. He went downstairs, made a final cup of coffee, and carried it out to the garage. It was 9:47 in the evening, which was the latest he'd been in the garage since Daisy had come home, because there was a bedtime to keep now. The Softail was nearly finished. He settled on the milk crate and picked up the torque wrench and worked in the low light with the radio off and the space heater ticking quietly in the corner, and he thought about a spider who does more than she has to. And he thought about a 6-year-old girl who had walked 16 miles in October to find the right door, and he thought these two things were not as different as they might seem. He worked for about an hour. Then he set the wrench down and reached into his shirt pocket. The drawing was still there. He had not moved it from his shirt pocket since the 8th visit, but tonight he took it out with the particular intention of a man who has decided something. He unfolded it along its worn crease lines, the paper soft now from months of being carried close to his chest, and he looked at it one more time. The two figures, the garage, the yellow lines of hair, the gray-brown scribbles of beard, and the word in the careful leftward-leaning letters of a child still learning her direction. Safe. He stood up and walked to the corkboard above the workbench. The board that had been there since the beginning. A business license for Mercer Custom Mechanics, a supplier's phone number written on a note card, a faded photograph of his mother standing in front of the house where he had grown up, her hand shading her eyes against the summer sun. A note from a customer that said best work in Knoxville that he had kept not for vanity, but because the man had written it by hand on an actual note card and put it in an actual envelope and mailed it, which seemed like the kind of effort that deserved acknowledgement. He pinned the drawing to the board, center, level with the photograph of his mother, so that the two of them occupied the same horizontal line on the cork. His mother squinting into the light of some long-ago summer, and two crayon figures standing in front of a garage in the hand of a child who had decided, without being shown, where safe was. He stepped back and looked at the board for a moment. Then he sat back down on the milk crate and picked up the wrench. Outside, Cedar Lane was February quiet, the deep, settled quiet of a residential street at 10 o'clock on a weeknight. Houses occupied, lights going off one by one, the ordinary world arranging itself for sleep. Somewhere at the end of the block, a dog barked once and went silent. A car passed without slowing. The fluorescent light above the workbench pulsed in its familiar rhythm, two short, one long, and held. From the room above the garage came no sound at all, just the particular silence of a child who is sleeping without listening for something bad. The full, unguarded silence of a body that has finally decided, after a long time of not being sure, that it is safe enough to go all the way down into sleep and stay there. Hank Mercer sat on his milk crate in the garage on Cedar Lane in the quiet of a February night, a wrench in one hand and a nearly finished Harley-Davidson on the lift in front of him, and he listened to that silence the way he had spent 45 years listening to machines, for what it was telling him, for what it meant. It meant she's here. It meant this is a house with someone in it now. It meant the silence is no longer the whole story. He turned back to the engine. He had maybe another hour of work before the Softail would be ready to run. When it was finished, when he finally turned it over and heard it catch, it would make that sound, not angry loud, not loud for the sake of loud, but the particular note of a thing that has been broken and is now whole, running the way it was built to run, doing what it was always meant to do. He figured Daisy would want to hear it. He would bring her out in the morning, if the weather held, and he would start the engine in the driveway, and she would stand next to him with her drawing pad, in case the sound turned out to be something she wanted to remember the shape of. And maybe she would decide the sound was like purring, which was what she'd said before. And maybe she'd decide it was something else entirely. Something she didn't have a word for yet, but would find one for eventually. The way she found words for everything, slowly, carefully, one at a time, only when she was sure. He could wait for that. He had learned in the past 4 months that waiting for Daisy was not the same as waiting in the old way. The heavy, purposeless waiting of a man with nowhere to be and no one coming. This was a different kind. The kind that has a direction. The kind that knows what it's waiting for and is glad to do it. He picked up the torque wrench and went back to work. The fluorescent light above the workbench pulsed twice and held. The house was quiet. Cedar Lane was quiet. And in the room above the garage, a 6-year-old girl slept without waking, her breathing slow and even and deep, her small body finally, completely still. Not the stillness of someone bracing for what comes next, but the stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere and knows it, and is resting in that knowledge the way you rest in a place that was made for you, or that you made for yourself by walking 16 miles in October and choosing, out of all the doors in the world, the right one.